A police officer who is racist thinks that a black man in the park is a thief and arrests him for no reason. Marcus Davis was sitting on a worn-out bench in Riverside Park when the police officer realized that he had just arrested an FBI agent. A warm glow illuminated the lush greenery in the late afternoon sun. He turned the page of the book he was reading. I lost myself for a moment in the distant laughter of children playing in the park and the quiet rustling of leaves. It was one of his favorite spots, a quiet haven in the middle of a busy city where he could shut off. Despite the demands of his job today, park cop Brian Harkins interrupted his thoughts. He quickly looked around the area with his sharp eyes. Having covered this beat for over 20 years, he knew what was happening. He knew this city better than anyone else. The sight of Marcus sitting alone on the bench filled him with a sense of loneliness. The sight of Marcus sitting alone on the bench filled him with a sense of loneliness. Over the years, his trust in a black man sitting alone and calm had grown. He couldn't help but feel suspicious, despite his apparent calmness. Brian muttered under his breath that he had never seen him around here before. Under his breath, he stopped walking and looked at Marcus for a moment, trying to figure out what he was feeling. Marcus was looking for a suspect who fit his general description. It was a weak lead, but it was enough for Brian. Marcus felt someone looking at him, so he put down his book and looked up. Brian was standing far away, staring. Marcus regarded him with a familiar expression. He had experienced situations similar to this before he could read them. The officer's face easily showed prejudice hiding as worry, a suspicion that based solely on the color of his skin. Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly closed his book and marked the page with his finger. He then looked up at Brian, and his grip on his stick tightened. Marcus's steady gaze terrified him. Let's see what. This guy's up to something, Brian said to himself as he walked toward Marcus. With each step, he tightened his back. Marcus observed him, but found the way he gazed at him unsettling. He didn't like how calm and fearless he seemed. Brian walked up to them with a blank face. He knew what was going to happen and had seen it many times before. He knew that his actions in the next few seconds would determine the outcome. He didn't want to do this today, but he wanted to avoid giving the police officer any reason to escalate the situation. In the afternoon, Brian reported that he spoke politely when he arrived at the bench, but Marcus could hear Marcus answering with a calm voice in the afternoon, and even he kept holding a clothes book in his lap, which was clearly visible. "What brings you out here today?" Brian asked. Looking at Marcus's face and then at the book, he was trying to find something, anything, to explain how he felt. Marcus told Brian that it was a wonderful day as he watched him enjoying the park. He was more interested in what Marcus wasn't saying and what he could get out of him. "Under the surface, you're from around here." Marcus smiled a little, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." Brian didn't like the non-answer, so he changed his stance and became more hostile. "Mind if I see some?" he said. Marcus's smile faded. This was where things could go wrong. He knew his rights and wasn't required to do anything. He was asked to show ID simply for sitting in a park, but he knew that refusing could quickly escalate the situation. Still, he wasn't going to let this cop scare him. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked in a calm voice. When asked the question, Brian's eyes remained unflinching. There was that calmness again, that refusal to be. He felt scared and like he was losing control of the situation. "If you don't do something, you will be in the same position." Brian fired back, placing his hand on his holster. Marcus inhaled deeply and held his breath. His face was blank. He didn't like where this was going, but wasn't going to back down. "I'm just sitting in park," he said in a steady voice. "Is there a law against that?" Brian was getting annoyed because you seemed like, "We're looking for someone," he stated. But even he was aware of the weakness in his reasoning. He moved closer and looked over Marcus. Marcus didn't move, and he kept Brian's eyes on him. Marcus softly inquired, causing Brian's jaw to drop. Marcus gently inquired, causing Brian's jaw to drop. He knew he didn't have a positive answer, but he didn't want to say it, because that would mean losing hope. He wasn't going to let that happen. "Don't be smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID now for a moment." The tension between them grew as the two men locked eyes. Marcus knew he could fight back and make his point. He knew that going against the law could make things even more dangerous, but he chose to do what was right for now. He reached slowly into his pocket and took out his wallet without saying a word. Brian watched every move. When Marcus gave Brian his ID, Brian snatched it out of his hand and moved closer. His body coiled like a spring, looked at it quickly. The name held no significance for him, but it didn't matter, as he was already prepared to rise. Brian told Marcus to move back to make room for him. Marcus sighed to himself but followed Brian's instructions. He kept his hands out in front of him on the bench to prevent Brian from feeling threatened. Brian spoke as he pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Marcus felt angry, but he suppressed it and turned around. Brian was able to cuff him without any trouble. He could tell that people nearby were looking at him, but he didn't care. He remained silent, understanding that expressing anger would only exacerbate the situation. As Brian tightened the cuffs around him, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that he was doing something wrong, but his pride prevented him from admitting it. He wasn't going to let him stop, so he grabbed Marcus's arm and led him to the nearest police car. Marcus didn't say a word as they walked. He was already thinking about what would come next, something that would not bother him. He knew who he was and that the police officer would soon find out, but he couldn't help but feel we were extremely exhausted and drained from more than just this one meeting. The exhaustion stemmed from the realization that, despite everything, despite his achievements and hard work, many still saw him as just another black guy. Officer Brian Harkins opened the back door of the police car and led Marcus inside as they got there. There was still a lot of tension in the air, so Marcus sat down on the southeast feet. The cold metal of his handcuffs bit into his arms. He looked out the window as the car drove out of the park and saw the trees blur by. He thought about how this day had come to be. The engine of Officer Brian Harkins' police car hummed as he drove Marcus Davis. This was yet another instance of an unexpected issue arising. Brian had a tight grip on the steering wheel as he drove toward the police station. His hands were white from thinking about what had just happened. Marcus had looked at him calmly and without fear in the park, as if he knew something. He didn't like that. Brian did it, which made him doubt his feelings. But he couldn't say that Marcus sat because he was too proud. He was sitting in the back seat with his hands cuffed behind him. The city streets went by quickly, but he wasn't thinking about them. He wasn't thinking about the scenery. He was thinking about what was going to happen next. It was clear to him that the system knew event speed. Things could get worse if he wasn't careful, but he knew his power. Job authority. That Officer Harkin didn't know about. As they approached the police station, Brian looked back at Marcus with a question. He asked, "What were you doing in that park?" His voice was tense with suspicion. Marcus looked Brian in the eyes in the mirror. "I told you," he answered calmly, but I couldn't read his face. "I was just reading Brian. I laughed at a guy like you who was just reading and thought I would believe him." Marcus arched an eyebrow and asked, "A guy like me?" in a measured voice. Brian contemplated the statement for a moment before grasping its meaning. He made a mistaken statement, but instead of apologizing, he repeated it. "You don't appear to be someone who spends his afternoons relaxing." He mentioned that he was reading in the park, attempting to clarify his actions. Marcus didn't answer right away. He let the silence last. It was getting more tense in the car, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm and collected. "It makes someone like me look like an officer." Brian didn't answer because he knew what he meant and how it sounded, but he wasn't going to tell Marcus or himself that, so he concentrated on inflaming his own anger. The quiet Marcus continued to bother him as the car pulled into the precinct's parking lot near Bryan Park. He left through the front door first, then the back door, and helped Marcus out while the cuff was still in Marcus's arm. Brian had a lot on his mind as they walked toward the building. He had to decide what to do next. Suspects should be scared and cooperative, not calm and defiant during arrests. During his whole speech, the precinct was filled with the normal buzz of activity, air officers filing reports on their phones. Despite the curious looks from other people, Brian led Marcus through the main hall while the hum of talk echoed around him. He didn't want to explain himself to the police yet because he wasn't sure what he was going to do next. Brian motioned for Marcus to stand by the processing desk. The officer working behind the desk was a young man. Officer Jenkins looked up, shocked to see Brian bringing someone in. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked for his. Brian caught Marcus acting strangely in the park. His eyes moved from Brian to Marcus and back again. Brian responded, but his voice trailed off. He provided Marcus's ID, but he refused to admit that he lacked a valid reason for arresting Jenkins. He glanced at the ID before turning his gaze back to Marcus. Marcus saw a flash of recognition in his eyes, but he quickly covered it up. Marcus noticed the brief pause and stored it in his mind as he began typing on the computer, nodding in agreement. Despite the slight difference, someone in the precinct knew who he was. "Captain Bennett is in her office." Jenkins told Brian, "You'll need to take him to her," as he gave him the ID back. Brian tensed up a bit. Bennett was known for being strict about following the rules. He hadn't meant to involve her so soon, but he did. Brian couldn't help himself, speaking in a stern voice as he grabbed Marcus's arm and said, "Let's go." Marcus walked with Brian, but Brian couldn't read Marcus's face as they got closer to Captain Bennett's office. The officer was diligently trying to conceal Brian's tense and uncertain state. It was the first sign of trouble. Marcus noted the change in the armor and was pleased with it. Brian knocked on the door and opened it when he heard the sound. From inside the office, Captain Bennett's voice came from a room with a big desk in the middle and shelves on either side. Captain Bennett, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a straightforward attitude, looked up from her books and papers. As they entered, she asked Officer Harkin in a neutral tone, "What's this about?" Brian stepped forward. "I caught this guy in the park, Captain," she said as she led Marcus into the room. "He was exhibiting unusual behavior and refused to comply with my requests." When Captain Bennett asked for Marcus's ID, there was a brief moment of recognition. She quickly covered it up, making her face look more professional. That's why she spoke in a Marcus-like voice. He saw the look of recognition in her eyes. He knew Captain Bennett knew who he was, but she was deceiving him. They were closely watching Brian to see how he would handle the situation. Indeed, Brian continued his actions, oblivious to the silence. Marcus and Bennett engaged in a conversation. "I brought him in for questioning." Bennett nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing. "A little, I see. And did you have a good reason to arrest him?" Brian asked. He could feel the ground moving beneath him. "Captain," he said again, though this time it sounded weaker. Captain Bennett leaned back in her chair and carefully looked at Brian. "Officer Harkin, would you mind taking a break outside for a moment?" "I'd like to talk to Mr. Davis alone for a moment," Brian said. He was surprised and blinks. But Captain outside Harkins, Bennett said it clearly, leaving no room for debate. Brian reluctantly let Marcus go and left the office. He exited by shutting the door behind him. Captain Bennett's behavior changed a little, becoming less formal. Davis said in a calm voice. "I'm sorry for this misunderstanding." Marcus gave himself a small smile and said, "No. I'm sorry, Captain. You're just doing your job." Bennett, looking sideways at the closed door, "I know who you are, but I'd like to keep that secret for now, as I need to exercise caution in this situation." Marcus nodded. "Of course I'm not here to cause trouble, Captain. I simply aim to ensure the proper handling of all matters." Bennett assured him, "I'll discuss this with Officer Harkin and handle it appropriately. But I must inquire why. Didn't you just tell him who you are?" Marcus's smile vanished, giving way to a more serious expression. "It shouldn't matter what race I am, Captain. That shouldn't affect how he treats me." Captain Bennett thought about his. He said these words, then nodded to indicate his agreement. "You're right. It shouldn't matter, but unfortunately it does for some people." The weight of the situation hung in the air for a moment as the room went quiet. At last, Captain Bennett rose to his feet and declared, "I will call Officer Harkin back in, and we'll take care of this," Marcus said again, watching as Captain Bennett moved to the... There was still a fight going on, but he knew he was winning. He knew the truth would come out soon. Officer Harkin's actions would undoubtedly result in consequences. As Captain Bennett opened the door, Brian stepped back. He gazed at Marcus with a suspicious expression, sensing a shift in circumstances that he couldn't quite pinpoint. Who was quietly waiting for Mr. Davis? "This is not the man you were looking for. You'll free him right away, Brian." He blinked, giving the words a moment to sink in. But Captain knew right away. Officer Bennett reiterated his statement, making it impossible for Brian to dispute it. He paused, then finally reached for the keys to open Marcus's locks. His hand trembled slightly as he realized his mistake. Marcus rubbed his wrists and gave Brian, with a measured look, he said, "Thank you, officer." His voice was calm, but there was an air of determination in it. Brian swallowed hard, not sure what to do. He stepped back and said, "You're free to go." Marcus nodded and turned to Captain Bennett. "I'll be in." "There's still a lot to talk about," the touch captain said quietly. Captain Bennett agreed, knowing what he meant. Weight behind what he said. "I look forward to it," Mr. Davis said. Marcus then left the office, leaving Brian standing there. His gut told him the fight was over, but the problems were just beginning. In the station, Harrin sat at his desk with constant tension. He had barely been able to focus. Ever since Captain Bennett let go of Marcus Davis, he's been feeling uneasy, and the fact that he still couldn't figure out what had happened. He knew he had done something wrong, but he couldn't quite grasp how terrible it was. His thoughts could go in any direction because the station was so quiet. It was both comforting and unsettling. Suddenly the sound of footsteps coming up to his desk woke him up. He looked up and saw Captain Bennett was walking toward him, her serious face making Brian's stomach tighten. He knew this wasn't going to work. "A relaxed chat. Officer Harkin's my office now," Captain Bennett told her. With a tone that left no room for debate, Brian immediately stood up and attempted to control his growing nervousness. Creeping into his mood, he followed her to the office, each step heavier than the last inside Captain. Bennett shut the door behind him and motioned for Brian to sit down. Brian thought about it for a moment before he did. I sensed the tension in the room, the weight of the unspoken future. Captain Bennett moved behind her desk. Sitting down across from him, she took a deep breath and set her sharp eyes on his officer, Harkin. She began to speak, stern. "Do you know who Marcus Davis is?" Brian shook his head, his confusion growing. "No, Captain," he said. "Some guy was in the park." Captain Bennett leaned forward and never took her eyes off of Marcus Davis. "His name is Brian. In the park, he serves as a special agent and is considered one of the best agents. The words hit Brian like a punch in the eyes. The consequences of what he had done hit him like a brick. He spoke in a barely audible voice. Bennett whispered, "That's correct." Her voice was firm, and she went on to say that he's highly respected in the office. His arrest will negatively impact everyone in this precinct, not just you. Brian's mind raced. He was trying to understand what this meant, but he had already apprehended a man, a federal agent no less, who wasn't guilty. He was solely considering things through the lens of his personal, biased opinions. As he realized how big his mistake was, he felt Captain Brian said in a shaky voice, "I didn't know who he was." "I didn't know who he was," Captain Brian said. "There was no need to worry about who he was," Bennett responded, her tone still firm. "What you did was based on biases and assumptions, not on any real proof. Arresting someone just because they don't look like they belong in a park is insufficient." Brian wanted to make that point, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. Deep down he knew Captain Bennett was right. He had let his beliefs control what he did, and now he has to deal with the results. "What happens now?" Brian asked in a low voice, almost giving up. Leaning back in her chair, she said, "We're putting you on temporary leave while we investigate what happened. I've already discussed the situation with the supervisors, and they're not pleased, to say the least. There will be an official review, and depending on the outcome, you might receive penalties up to and including termination." Brian's heart sinks. The word firing hung in the air like a death sentence. He had been a police officer for over 20 years and considered it was difficult for him to lose his job at V, but he was determined to persevere. Lie about it. He knew he only had himself to blame. "I get it, Captain Brian." Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible above a whisper. Bennett looked at him for a moment, her face softening a bit. "I know," she said. "That's unpleasant to hear, Harkin, but you need to know that what you do has effects on more than just you. We cannot have officers who make decisions based on their personal preferences, given the importance of the people they serve." Brian agreed. Even though he was still in shock, the truth of his situation was beginning to sink in, and a rush of, he felt terrible about what he did, because he had always been proud of being a decent cop who followed the law and kept the neighborhood safe. All of that was in danger because of one careless, biased choice. Captain Bennett stood up to show that the talk was over. "You're fired, Officer Harkin. I'll let you know when." Brian also rose to his feet, experiencing a profound sense of burden. "Thank you, Captain," he said. Before turning around and leaving the office, he mumbled something. As he left the station, he heard and saw things that were familiar. Once made him feel better, it now made him feel far away, almost like an alien. As he strolled towards his car, he contemplated the reality of his situation. The setting was like a thick fog over him. He had been a police officer for so long that he had forgotten who he was. He was afraid of losing the badge and coming across as a loser. But beneath the fear was something else, a strange feeling of doubt. For the first time, Brian had to face that reality, the fact that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the good cop he had always thought he was. That maybe as he drove home, his opinions and biases had influenced him more than he wanted to admit. As Brian watched the city streets blur by, he couldn't get Marcus Davis's calm, unwavering look out of his mind. He hadn't been sure about that look from the start, and now he knew why Marcus had seen right through him. Everything was in motion even before Brian arrived. After Brian arrived home, he spent some time in his car. He stared at the steering wheel for a long time, replaying the events of the day in his mind, each time intensifying his feelings. The pain intensified as he contemplated his actions. He didn't know what the future held, but he did know that his life had just changed. Brian sighed deeply and got out of the car. He then walked into his house. He sank into a chair, the empty room's silence pressing in on him. His mind was a mess of fear and sorrow. For the first time in a long time, Brian Harkin didn't know what to do next. He stood in the quarter. He could feel his heart racing outside the conference room. The area was quieter than normal, and the mood was tense. Before the official review began, Brian knew every word was crucial. Everyone was excited to see what would happen. He said that what happened in the next hour would decide the rest of his career. He looked at himself in the window across from him. He looked older and more worn out than he did just a few days before. His body and eyes stiffened after he stood up straight. The uniform form took a deep breath and focused. This was his chance to explain and defend what he had done. Captain opened the door to the meeting room. Bennett didn't look like she was thinking. "We're ready for you, Officer Harkins," she said in a steady voice. "Yes." He swallowed hard as he followed her into the room. Inside, the mood was tense, and the long table was covered with people with serious faces working for the PRI's Internal Affairs section. 2 very important cops and a man in a suit at the far end, who Brian knew Marcus Davis was noticed right away. Brian was taken aback by Marcus's presence, as he had hoped he wouldn't show up. He wouldn't have to face him again, but there he was, sitting quietly with his eyes on Brian, as if when she looked at him, her eyes had the same calm, unflinching look as before. Captain Bennett sat down at the head of the table. She had a quiet authority that made Brian feel small. He told Brian to sit in the chair across from him and tried to ignore the fact that his hands were making the room sweat. It was quiet, and the air officer Harkin Bennett opened her voice in an official way. She sensed that someone was passing judgment on her. "Consider whether your arrest of Mr. Marcus Davis was justified. We'll discuss what happened before and up to the arrest, what you did during the arrest, and the results. Do you understand how serious this is?" "Yes, Captain Brian," he answered in a low but steady voice. He then took a quick look at Marcus, who was watching him carefully before turning his attention back to Bennett. "Good," Bennett said, nodding. "Let's start with the incident. Report. Based on what you said, you arrested Mr. Davis because you thought he was a suspect in a recent string of thefts. Is that right?" Brian said. "Yes, Captain. I saw him in the park, and the tall black man in his early 40s fit the description. I approached him with suspicion and inquired about his unusual behavior." Bennett questioned her in a relaxed manner, but Brian paused because he knew his answer was important. "He was sitting alone when I asked for his response." Brian explained that when Bennett pressed him to show his ID, he was vague and said he didn't want to right away. He seemed like he was hiding something, even though the words sounded weak to him as he said them. A calm but strong voice cut through the air. "I was reading a book," the officer said. "Exactly what a thief would do." On the run, Brian jerked a little when Marcus spoke, but he kept his attention on, "I was just trying to do my job as a captain and keep the neighborhood safe." "Bennett, did you find anything on Mr. Davis?" That would mean he was involved in any kind of crime. Bennett questioned her, his eyes narrowing slightly. Head no one. He was clean. There was a prolonged silence, followed by a profound silence. As everyone in the room contemplated the previous remarks, one of the Internal Affairs officers raised his voice. His name was Stern Officer Harkins. "Have you ever thought that Mr. Davis might have been telling the truth when he said he wasn't the person you were looking for?" Brian paused again, his mind racing to find the right words. "I was following protocol. We were taught to be cautious and assume that someone might be dangerous until they could demonstrate otherwise." "Do you believe that factors other than protocol could have influenced your assumptions?" the officer asked. I didn't mean to be rude, but Brian's throat got tight. He knew what they were saying, and he knew there wasn't a good answer. To describe him, he said in a slightly shaky voice, "I was just doing my job." Marcus leaned forward slightly and spoke. "Your job is to serve and protect Officer Harkin, not to look at Brian. Think about how someone looks before you judge them." Brian initially felt defensive when he looked into Marcus's eyes, but a wave of guilt soon followed. He had been a police officer long enough to know when he was wrong. This was one of those instances where Captain Bennett cleared her throat to refocus attention on her officer. "Harkins, this review is about how you felt and did that day, in addition to what happened. We need to make sure that every police officer in this precinct upholds the beliefs of justice and fairness. This isn't just it's not about you, it's about the honesty of the whole police force." Brian had a terrible feeling in his gut. What was at stake wasn't just whether he had done something wrong, it was also whether he should keep the badge. Suddenly he knew what he had to do. It was challenging for him to find the words to say, "I understand, Captain." He spoke in a barely audible whisper. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to." He stopped speaking as his throat hurt. Although Captain Bennett's tone stayed strong, she did soften a bit. "We all make mistakes," she said, "but it's how we deal with them that matters. Our past mistakes have shaped who we are today. You should really think about what kind of officer you want to be." After another long pause, everyone in the room felt the weight of what was happening. Then Marcus spoke again. Voice is calm but authoritative. "Captain Bennett, may I say something?" Bennett agreed. "Of course, mister." Marcus stood up, drawing everyone's attention to him. He looked straight at Brian, and his face showed it. "I understand that being a police officer is hard work, and that you are always under a lot of pressure. Stress can sometimes lead people to make poor decisions, but we must not ignore these poor choices. It's not enough to hold Officer Harkins responsible. We need to make sure that this doesn't happen again." Brian listened with a sad heart. He knew Marcus was right, but it was challenging for him to accept the truth. He had spent his whole life believing Marcus. He believed he was doing the right thing, but now he had to face the fact that what he had done had hurt others. His biases had prevented him from seeing the truth. Marcus kept his voice steady and said, "I'm not here to ruin anyone's career, but my job is to ensure that the next time a police officer sees someone like me, they reconsider their decision. This is a chance for change, and I hope that the people in this precinct will take it seriously, Captain Bennett." Marcus sat down again with his eyes still on Brian and nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Davis," she said thoughtfully. His eyes were not mean, but they were hard and determined, making it clear that he wouldn't stand for any further injustice. Captain Bennett looked at Brian. Her voice was softer, but she was still serious. "Officer Harkins," she said, "you'll stay on temporary leave while we continue this review. I hope you use this time to reflect on our discussion. We'll get together again in a few days to talk about the next step." Brian nodded numbly, feeling the weight of everything pushing on him. Placing his hand on him, he quietly said, "Yes, Captain, the meeting has concluded." As the officials left the room, Brian stayed seated, his mind running. He had come to this review hoping to defend himself and explain what he had done. Now all he could think about was how wrong he had been. It was a stark reality from which he was unable to break free. Escape. As the final official exited the room, Brian slowly rose to his feet, the bird in his mouth slowing his steps. Before leaving, he gave Marcus a final glance. For a split second, their eyes met, and Marcus's look did not show any anger. There was only a quiet resolve to see justice done, and Brian turned away. He knew he had a lot to think about and deal with, as he couldn't hold Marcus's look any longer. As he left the meeting room, the weight of what he had done and what would happen next hung over him like a dark cloud. Cloud Captain Laura Bennett sat in her office and stared at the stack of reports on her desk. She looked at each piece of paper with full attention. Reflected a piece of the truth that she was trying to put together in the investigation into Brian. Harkin's behavior was evident, and it was her responsibility to meticulously examine every detail. She rubbed her temples and felt the stress on her shoulders. The precinct had always taken pride in maintaining high standards, but this event had shaken that foundation, and Bennett knew that the investigation would continue no matter what the result was, would have significant effects not only on Brian, but also on the whole department. She took a deep breath and reached for the first report, which was the first set of witness accounts from the park. She had read them several times before. Each time it was read, it contributed to the mounting evidence against Brian. The witnesses were all park-goers who were there at the time. The arrest and stark clarity both said Brian went up to Marcus Davis, thinking that Bennett was a criminal, turned on Davis right away, and didn't try to calm him down. She had seen the body cam video several times before reporting it, each time making her feel worse than the last. The video was crystal clear, clearly displaying Brian's voice and tone, and Shan. The aggressiveness in Marcus's approach showed what he thought about him from the moment he saw him. Marcus ignored them when they attempted to describe the force he used during the arrest. Marcus laid it all out for them, bare for anyone to see. A knock at the door woke Bennett up. She looked up and saw Detective Harper. The person in charge of the investigation next to her was standing in the hallway. "I have the last witness," he said. Harper said he was holding up a file for interviews. "Thanks," Harper replied. "We have Marcus Davis scheduled for later this afternoon. How's it looking?" Bennett took the file from Harper and ran his hand through his graying hair. "Not good," Harper said. "Captain, most witnesses are certain of what they saw, and body cam video supports this." Bennett grimly agreed. "I was afraid of that." "Are we bringing Brian in for another round of questions?" Harper asked. Bennett said as she leaned back in her chair, "Let's see if he's ready to talk about what happened in a more open way." Harper gave his consent and departed from the office, leaving Bennett alone to handle the file. Bennett opened it and began reading it. The new witness accounts were consistent with the previous ones. Brian's violent behavior was evident from the beginning. Marcus had clearly been trying to calm things down, but Brian hadn't paid attention. When Bennett was done reading, she was very uneasy. She had known Brian for a long time and thought he was a competent police officer. But this event showed Bennett a side of him that he had never seen before. The hours went by slowly as Bennett. She continued to review the proof until she heard another knock on the door. Harper and Brian came in, followed by Harper. Harkin Bennett said in a calm voice. Brian looked tired, his eyes dark from not getting enough sleep. He sat down. The man opposite Bennett was nervously glancing at Harper, who was seated next to him. "We're going to go over the events of that same day." Bennett leaned forward slightly and said, "I need you to be completely honest with us, Brian. This is your opportunity to present your perspective." Brian nodded, but his face was tight. "I get it." Captain Bennett looked at Harper, who had asked Brian, "Brian, tell us what was going through your mind." "When you saw Marcus Davis for the first time in the park," Brian paused, his eyes moving as he tried to find the right words. "I saw a man who looked like the suspect we were looking for. It was a challenging situation that I had to navigate, quickly decide, and what made you so sure that he was the suspect?" "ECT," Harper asked. "He matched the description," Brian said. He repeated himself, adopting a more defensive tone. "We are currently seeking a black man of similar height and build," he stated. As if he were trying to hide something, Bennett could tell by the strain in Brian's voice and the way he was holding on tight. Despite what Brian said, the witness statements and body cam video show a different story. They show that Davis was kind enough to try to explain who he was, but you didn't pay attention. Brian shifted in his seat uncomfortably. At the time, he was trying to throw me off because I was just following my training. Bennett reiterated his statement in a more authoritative tone. "Sharp, Brian. Your training does not justify profiling people based on their race, nor does it justify making matters worse when you do both. It did not need to get worse." Brian started to answer, but Bennett stopped him with a hand. "Look, Brian, I'm not," Bennett said. "Our goal is not to engage in conflict with but to uncover the truth. The proof we have so far doesn't support your case. It shows that you made assumptions about people based on their race, and those assumptions led to an unfair arrest." There was a long silence as Brian contemplated Bennett's words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "I was just trying to do my job," Bennett said. Bennett sighed. "I know, Brian, but your intentions don't change how your actions reach others. It's not just about you, but also about your actions and their impact on the individuals we're responsible for protecting." Before Brian could answer, there was a knock on the door again. Harper stood up and opened it, letting Marcus Davis in. He entered the room with a calm and composed demeanor. "Mr. Davis, thank you for coming in," Bennett said as he stood to shake hands. Marcus held out his hand, nodded, and maintained a neutral expression. Captain Bennett then gestured for Marcus to take a seat and turned back to Brian. "Brian, we're going to hear from Mr. Davis now. Please pay close attention," he said. He nodded, but he couldn't look Marcus in the eyes. Bennett motioned for Harper to start. "Mr. Davis, could you describe your meeting with Officer Harkins from your point of view?" Marcus's voice was steady. "While I was enjoying my day off at the park, Officer Harkin walked up to me and was rude from the start. He asked to see my ID and questioned me like I was a criminal. I tried to tell him that I was an FBI agent and that there must have been a mistake, but he wouldn't listen. He cuffed me, pushed me to the ground, and treated me like a criminal, so I didn't listen." Brian jerked at Marcus's Harper and asked, "Did you feel that?" He didn't say a word and kept his eyes on the table in front of him. "Officer, your race influenced Harkin's actions." Marcus didn't think twice. I could see it in his eyes. He made assumptions about me before I even had a chance to speak. I've dealt with things like that before, but it's different when it comes from someone who is meant to serve and protect. Bennett could feel the difference. Of Marcus's words about Brian, how his shoulder sagged a little and how he seemed to pull in on himself. But still, Brian didn't say anything. But Mr. Davis Bennett did say, "Thank you for being honest." Marcus nodded and stood up to leave as he spoke. As he got to the door, he stopped and turned back to Brian. "I don't harbor a grudge against Officer Harkins, but I hope you can. This is an opportunity to learn how your actions affect others, not just what you meant. It's about how those plans work out in the real world." Bennett and Marcus left the room, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. I glanced at Brian, who continued to gaze at the table. "Brian," I told him, "this investigation isn't just about finding out what happened. It's how can we make sure it doesn't happen again. We need to do better for ourselves and the people who serve." He slowly agreed, but the weight of the proof and Marcus Davis's words had worn him out. The reality of what he had done was beginning to sink in, but it was still unclear if he was ready to face the truth. Brian Bennett said quietly, "Take the rest of the day. We'll meet again tomorrow." Brian stood still. Bennett remained silent as he exited the office. As the door shut behind him, Bennett felt a heavy sense of duty. Pull herself together. This study was merely the beginning. A significant amount of work remained both inside and outside the department. But for now, all she could do was keep putting the pieces of the truth together. They hoped it would lead to real change. Captain Laura Bennett read the final report of the investigation in her office. As she rested her head on her desk, she had reached a clear conclusion and made her choice. However, that didn't make the job ahead any easier. She looked at the clock, knowing that Marcus Davis would soon be there for the talk they were about to have. Not just for Brian Harkin, but for the entire department, it felt like a gentle nudge. Marcus arrived and Bennett stood up and smoothed the front of her uniform, getting ready for the talk. "Come in," she said, and the door opened. Marcus walked in, looking as calm and collected as ever. He gave Bennett a nod politely and then sat down opposite her. "Thank you for coming," he said. Mr. Davis Bennett did the same. "Of course," Marcus answered in a steady voice. "I think the investigation is over." Bennett confirmed this by leaning forward. "After reviewing all the evidence, including witness statements, body cam videos and interviews, we have decided to fire Officer Harkin." Marcus slowly nodded, taking in the information. "I like how thorough the study was, Captain, but I have to ask, do you think this choice will lead to..." Bennett paused, thinking carefully about what she was going to say. "I believe it's a significant step forward, headed in the right direction. Brian Harkin's actions were wrong, and his firing clearly demonstrates this. We will not stand for racial profiling or power abuse, but I also know that firing one cop isn't the answer. Address the more significant issues at hand." Marcus's eyes stayed on the subject as he answered, "You're right. This is about more. In more than one cop. It's about the department's culture, the training officers receive, and the potential for biases to manifest. If we don't address the underlying problems, people in the field will make decisions based on these factors." Bennett nodded, understanding Marcus's point. "I'm committed to making that happen, and we're already working on adding more to our training classes. We are providing comprehensive training on racial bias and de-escalation methods. We also want to make the rules more strict." "That's a positive start with the control and accountability measures," Marcus said with a hint of approval in his voice. "But it's going to get worse. In addition to changing the rules, we must help officers understand the IM. It takes time to change the way they act and how it affects the people they serve." Bennett said it would be a long and challenging process, but we need to do it if we want to rebuild faith and make sure that someone else doesn't have to go through what you did. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Thoughtful. "I've been a police officer for a long time, and I know that change is hard, especially when it involves people. I know it will be challenging to face uncomfortable facts, but I'm ready to work with you, Captain, to make those changes. This isn't just about Bennett feeling a surge. It's about making a safer, more fair system for everyone." Because he respected Marcus, who had endured a great deal, he was still prepared to work for the changes we were sorely needed, and I appreciate what Mr. Davis Bennett said. As we move forward, we will learn a lot from your experience and ideas, and I want you to know that we will listen to your opinions. Marcus spoke up and said, "Thank you, Captain. I'm not looking for any special treatment. I just want to confirm that the people in this town deserve the best police department possible, and that's what the officers are working toward." Bennett couldn't agree with you more. "You're right, and I promise we'll work hard to make that happen." Both of them fell silent for a moment, reflecting on the importance of the conversation and choice. The firing of Brian Harkin was only the beginning. The real work lay ahead in the form of changes, and a shift in the way people think. Marcus stood to leave. Bennett rose, who also extended her hand, knowing that action was necessary to prevent future wrongs. As before, thank you very much, Mr. Davis. I look forward to working with you. Marcus shook her hand firmly too. Make sure this is a turning point and not just a short-term response. Marcus departed from the office, leaving Bennett by himself. She took one last look at the closed investigation report on her desk before she turned her attention to something else. Future had made the decision. Now it was up to her and the staff to see it through to the end. Change that lasts. She knew the road ahead would be hard, full of obstacles and resistance, but Bennett. I was ready. This wasn't just about one officer or one event. It was about doing the right thing. Without giving up, Bennett grabbed her phone and started making the calls, no matter how hard that might be. That would initiate the necessary changes for the department's growth, and she would make every effort to ensure these changes were implemented. Yes, it did. The morning was cloudy, and as Marcus Davis ascended the station's steps, the air felt heavy. The city was tense, anticipating the next move. Inside, things were tight, but people were excited because they were starting to see the changes that Captain Bennett had promised. There was still a long way to go. As Marcus walked into the building, he noticed small changes in the atmosphere. There was a bulletin board near the front door with information about future workshops on racial bias and how to de-escalate situations. People walked through the halls with a different vibe. They were talking less loudly and more seriously about what had happened in the last few weeks. Had a lasting effect on everyone. Marcus walked to Captain Bennett's office and bows to the officers as he passes them. Some of the people he passed looked at him with respect, while others tried to avoid his eyes. He was still trying to figure out what had happened when he got to Bennett's office and saw that the door was slightly open. He softly knocked and then pushed the door open. "Come in," Bennett called from her desk. Marcus stepped inside and closed the door. The door behind him, Bennett rose, got up from her chair, and gave him a warm smile. "Good to see you again, Mr. Davis," she said. Captain Marcus responded, "I wanted to see how things were going, so I sat down across from her." Bennett agreed. She looked serious, but determined. "We're making progress. We're implementing new training programs, and while increasing control to ensure accountability is a start, much work remains." Marcus liked how honest she was. Change takes time, but it's encouraging to see the steps you are taking. "There has been some pushback from the department in charge of it," Bennett said. "Not all cops are on board, but most of them are. Recognize the necessity of these modifications. We've had some difficult conversations, but I'm hopeful that we're on the right track." Marcus leaned forward a little and looked straight ahead. "That's pleasing to hear. It's important to keep the energy going to make sure these changes aren't just a one-time thing," agreed Bennett. "Said that this is about building a new base for how we work, one that is based on fairness and respect for everyone, one we serve." As they talked, the office door opened again, and Brian Harkin walked in. He had a sad look on his face. He had fatigued eyes, was wearing simple clothes, and had a cardboard box in his hands. It was clear that he was here to gather the last of his belongings. Captain Brian welcomed Bennett sternly and avoided eye contact with Marcus Brian. Bennett responded in a neutral tone. For a moment the room was quiet, and the air was thick with unresolved tension. Marcus, his face tightening, said, "Mr. Davis, I just wanted to say I didn't mean to. This is how things turned out." Marcus looked him in the eye and said, "It's not about what you meant, Officer Harkins. It's about Brian. Please explain what you did and how it affected people." Marcus was shocked by his directness, but he agreed to hear the truth. "I know, I just don't know how to fix it. To start, you can admit that there is a problem. Everyone has biases. The key is how to handle them, as Marcus said. That matters. You can use this to improve yourself and become a better person. He turned back to Bennett, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His voice was just above the Bennett nodding and saying, "I guess this is it." Her face softened as she said, "Brian, you don't have to be sad. You can learn from this and change your life, but you decide." Brian stood there for a moment. She said, "I'll think about it," and he gave her a short nod. He then paused and said, "Good luck, Captain, and to you." As well as Mr. Davis, Brian turned and left the office, leaving the door behind him with a soft click. Bennett and Marcus watched him leave, each lost in thought. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Bennett asked Marcus after a moment. She sighed and leaned back in her chair. "I hope so, but we can't change that now. All we can do is focus on the work in front of us." Marcus concurred with us, a sentiment that was widely shared. They sat there quietly for a moment, feeling the weight of their talk still going on when Marcus finally stood up and shook Bennett's hand. "Thank you for everything," he said. "Captain, I respect how driven you are to make things right." Bennett shook his hand firmly and said, "Thank you, Mr. Davis. Your assistance has been invaluable. We are all involved in this together." Marcus left the building and made his way to. He walked one last time through the station. As he went down the halls, he could feel the eyes of the police officers on him. After thinking about it, he knew change would be hard but necessary. The last few weeks opened a door, and now they had to all go through it. Marcus stepped outside in the cool air. He took a deep breath of the fresh morning air and felt a sense of determination settle over him. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to keep fighting for justice. He was determined to see it through to the end, as this was just the beginning. As Marcus left the station, he was more determined than ever. He could already see the next steps he needed to take in his work. There was still a lot to do, but he felt hopeful for the first time in a long time that things would change. He would be present at every stage, providing guidance and support,